The PRovoke Podcast, brought to you by PRovoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.
Hello everyone and welcome to the PRovoke Media podcast. I'm Maja Pawinska Sims, Global Head of Features and EMEA News at PRovoke, and I'm joined today by two brilliant guests from Fin Partners. David Krejci, a partner at Fin, is a pioneer in media forensics and an expert on misinformation, disruptive technologies and bad faith actors. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Maja.
And secondly, we have your colleague, Jessica Ross. Jessica leads global public affairs at Fin, and she's an expert in issues management, crisis communications, and the intersection of policy and business. Jessica, welcome.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
Just to set the scene, although the way this year is going, this is likely to be out of date in about 20 minutes. 2025 has already seen rapid and significant disruption in the media, policy and business landscape. And meanwhile, the increasing sophistication of disruptive tech is leading to further confusion. David and Jessica are here today to discuss the state of play in this current turbulent environment we're all living through and share their insights, tips and best practices for navigating the complexity of a rapidly changing business environment for agencies, in-house teams and their clients and brands. So let's start off with kind of the state of play. Where are we now? The year's already got off to a wild start. What do you think have been the most significant disruptions in the media, policy and business world so far this year? And how is this affecting how brands communicate? Jessica, do you want to start with that one?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think what we've seen is a radical reorganization and shift in ideas and norms and the marketplace. And what that's created is an enormous amount of uncertainty. It's created uncertainty for many actors, including companies, including sovereigns, including media. So I think we're in the middle of this transformation where we're sort of wadding up our old playbooks and moving to an entirely different mode of risk management. And I think that transformation is ongoing, and we will continue to be in that space for months and years to come.
Absolutely. David, what would you add to that?
I would absolutely agree, of course, with what Jess is saying. From my world, from my perspective in thinking about some of the tools and disruptive technologies that are doubling down on the problem of the uncertainty and the ambiguity that Jess just mentioned is really where we're at in March of 2025. So we have been experiencing a lot of disruption in the media ecosystem for many, many years now, and it continues to get worse. But one of the things that makes it worse is ambiguity and uncertainty, because people are always looking for information to guide their lives, right? And the more uncertainty that you throw into their information ecosystem, so to speak, as they're hunting for truths that they're comfortable believing and abiding by and living by, the more uncertainty that you pour into their search for information, the more that they are fed information that subscribes to their pre-existing beliefs. So the interesting point is not just, to me anyway, it's not just that we are in an ambiguous state. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. It means that we are kind of doubling down on our own lack of knowledge about what is actually happening, because we continue through the algorithms and the way that social and the traditional media ecosystem works. We are continually just being fed more and more information that, as I said, subscribes to what we already believe. So we're not really gaining anything in knowledge. We are going further down the rabbit hole of being more confused, which is, of course, totally in line with what Jess said about the uncertainty. But I guess I'm just trying to point out that when that uncertainty increases, it really double and triples down then on our social media behavior and the information that we're seeing, because it's largely just reaffirming what we're seeking anyway.
Absolutely. It's a kind of never-ending spiral, isn't it? And we'll dive down into a bit more misinformation in a bit. But Jessica, just to go back a bit to how the political shifts we're seeing at the moment, that they require really careful balance in messaging, don't they? How do we manage that in this time of uncertainty?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the things that we've been seeing across sectors and across geographies is the need to move from sort of traditional messaging models and here's our yearly plan and this is our momentum release to really a kind of a scenario planning and risk management model. So that requires a really clear-eyed adaptation of business practices. So really workshopping and determining what are the risks and challenges in the marketplace, and then how do you build, better strategies moving forward that can allow you to be successful in a dynamic marketplace. So it's there's a really interesting sort of push and pull between, wanting to be consistent and authentic and not moving away from sort of core values, but also being realistic about the environment that everyone is operating in. So it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very delicate, isn't it? And we have the additional layer of really fast evolving tech at the moment. David, from your perspective as a media forensics expert, how are the disruptive tech and AI developments contributing to this changing landscape in media and comms? Do you think we're seeing an actual increase in misinformation as a result, or are we just more aware of it?
I think both of those things are true. I think we are seeing more, and we are fortunately becoming more aware of it for sure. Interestingly, in the run up to the election, there was, by some measures, more misinformation happening, and that's not a surprise, as both candidates and both parties are trying to get their information out. Information has a way of becoming distorted as it moves its way through the chain. So I don't want to imply that it wasn't incredibly grave back then, and to some degree, at least along those topics, we have seen a decrease in the misinformation. There was a lot of foreign state actor intervention in our political candidacy, during our election cycle. So while that has somewhat dropped off, obviously the insertion of AI into this whole equation is, we probably all say from time to time, like, I can't believe that happened too. Just compounding problem upon problem upon problem for how people are trying to ascertain truth for their lives. Then AI shows up and it changes the game in many ways. But I really look at AI, I've said this many times, what do you think about fire? Well, it heats my home, but it can burn it down too. And certainly that is true with AI. So as much as AI can be used and leveraged to create deep fakes and do some really terrifying things by, stealing the image of a CEO and the voice of a CEO, or any of the other isolated incidences that we've seen, AI is also a powerful tool, for example, in our arsenal on the forensic side of being able to look at 100,000 social media posts and figure out not just the sentiment and the volume of brand mentions, but the actual architecture of the narrative as it's going through the internet. Who is sharing it? Why are they sharing it? What platforms are they using to share it? AI plays a big role in being able to figure out relatively quickly what would take, 7 human beings 4 weeks to figure out.
Yeah.
So certainly, I don't want to dismiss what you're saying, that the AI has definitely made the challenge more challenging, and it certainly made it a lot more colorful. I think the fundamental problem is much richer and more complicated than the advent or the introduction into, these AI tools that people can use today.
It's just so complex, isn't it? It's like everyone's just got this matrix in their head now. It's almost like I know party politics is very definitely a thing still, but it's the intersections between what's going on society, business, politics, tech. It's just the most complicated landscape we as human beings have ever experienced, hasn't it? I mean, there's just as humans trying to orientate yourself and center yourself with all this going on around you, let alone as advisors. It's a very confusing time, isn't it?
Yeah, and one of the jokes in my head that I make all the time is that I wish I could live to be like 200 so I could read the history books about what they say about what's going on, because we have no perspective, right? We're in the middle of the chaos and we do what we can to try to figure it out, but we're not going to really understand that complexity that you're talking about and the intersection of all the things. I like to believe, but I don't have that perspective. So this is just a theory, but I like to believe that all of the things you just mentioned are highly intersecting with one another and compounding problems, exponentially. So it's not just the disruptive technologies. It's not just the algorithms. It's not just the political climate. All of those things are coming together in this moment, creating the complexity of the problem that we are trying to address. And, I look at our department, the forensics department, as trying to do our best without the hindsight of 50 or 100 years, do our best to really understand the nuances and the complexity of how a narrative, how a story gets distorted through our ecosystem, and help our clients understand how to best avoid the problems, the turbulence along the way, while conceding that this is a challenge, that all the rules have changed, that you can't come out with a positive forward-looking statement or a great press release or many of the tactics that might have been really successful 5, 10, or 15 years ago, just to accept the reality that this is happening. I speak in metaphors all the time, either because I'm an English major or because I always speak in metaphors. I became an English major. So I say that as a forgiveness as I talk in metaphors, probably more than anyone wants. But I think about it in terms of, you're having a parade, but it's raining. It is raining on our parade right now, and nothing that we can do is going to stop it from raining. We can put on raincoats and bring an extra pair of socks and all that kind of thing. But to understand and concede first and foremost that the challenges that we face as communicators is so wholly different than it's ever been, that it takes an entirely new set of approaches, of data, of strategies to be able to function within this environment, and to try to hope for the same results that you might have gotten successfully 10 or 15 years ago is going to drive you crazy, because you're not going to get there. It's not going to roll out that way. And human nature, of course, is such that, well, I've done it this way for 5, 10, 15, in some cases, in my case, 30 years. You don't get to do that anymore because it's raining. And so as I look to the kind of arc of where we're headed, the first and foremost point that I try to get across is, can we all just agree that the complexity of what we are seeing is so intense that it takes far more than a stratcom leader or a social media leader. It takes the mindset of a social psychologist and an anthropologist and many other disciplines to be able to come together to say, this is what is happening today in our environment, or specifically, this is what is happening to your brand, or this is what you should be doing to our brand. So I advocate a lot for just a broader perspective, bringing in different insights in different areas of discipline and expertise, because the rounder your perception of what's happening from other areas of expertise, the better prepared you are to be able to handle a crisis, if that should happen, or even if you're just coming out with a new product, a new service, a new announcement, and so forth, just conceding again that it's raining, and to understand more holistically what this message that you are putting out into this chaotic stream of information is going to do once you set that into the stream.
This is absolutely fascinating stuff. Like we can't just approach comms as traditional communicators anymore, can we? Like you said, like the rules have changed. This old playbook of clear, consistent, authentic messaging has just sort of been thrown out the window. And yet brands are often still trying to press ahead with their old comms strategies. What can they be doing differently? Jess, do you want to start with that one?
Sure, absolutely. And and thanks for that, David. I happen to be a failed English major who actually became a social scientist and ended up studying sociology, political science, and economics. So thanks for setting me up with that intro. Look, there's an interesting parallel here, which is, from a therapeutic conceptual lens, there's this idea of negative pleasure, right? And negative pleasure is where we live in a place of grief and rumination and intrusive thoughts. And I think that is that's consistent with what David was talking about, with how people are getting and receiving their news, and maybe even how business leaders are looking at the ecosystem. So I think that the same way, from a therapeutic lens, that we would suggest that, an individual seek community, feel able to speak their truth, seek out kindness. I feel like for the work, applying that same lens is about thinking how to build our campaigns for sort of the greater good, right? And I'm working on a campaign right now where one of the things that we thought about is, how do we take the message and make a bigger tent, make a bigger community tent, make it more universal? And then how do we build a coalition that becomes a community of practice, a community of endorsers? So who are the voices that we can enlist? And in this particular case, we enlisted celebrities, elected officials, subject matter experts. Whereas in, the before times, maybe we just, use a CEO or a subject matter expert and kind of stay in our swim lane. We're finding that we need, in order to be successful, we need to, build more broadly and build in a way that builds our community. So I think that is one of the ways to sort of counter this negative pleasure, which is to tell, to really rethink how we're telling the stories and who are the voices that are telling them.
Absolutely. And David, I want you to add to that, but you touched on earlier the issue of information overload, and part of that is, as in the title of this podcast, is doom scrolling, right? This isn't just mindlessly scrolling through your phone. Something's actually going on in your brain to when you do this, when we consume so much information, whether that's good information or bad information. How does that impact our ability to discern the truth and to understand what messages we should be listening to?
Yeah, one of my favorite questions, and here's where I guess reinforce what I just said about it takes a broader swath of disciplines and expertise to understand what is happening. And I am going to now pretend that I have some sort of social psychology expertise, which I don't. But reading what I do along these lines and trying to understand what is going on while you're doom scrolling is a source of fascination for me. And it's really easy to just stay superficially that, there's just so much info, I don't know what to read anymore, and I don't know who to trust. And that, of course, is 1,000% true. But what is also happening on a psychological level inside your brain when you are doom scrolling is you are relying on this old millennia, 1,000-year-old, this is what I mean by, I'm not an expert in this in anthropology, but for millions of years, we developed a trait to be able to respond quickly to our environment. And so if you're hunting 50,000 years ago and you hear a sound in the bush, you have two choices in your head. That's either a meal or it's a predator that's going to harm or kill me. And you don't have time to get out a camera and measurements and figure out what kind of animal that is based upon the sound and the scent and so forth. It would be preposterous to take a scientific method approach and to figure out, is that predator or prey in that bush? But you have developed over time the ability to make a snap judgment. And it's called heuristic neural processing, but that term is irrelevant. The point is that we have developed an ability to, when forced to not have the time to critically think about a situation, we use this heuristic neural processing, this snap judgment thinking. So think about while you're doom scrolling and you are on a news feed or any social channel, and you're just going by one after the other, after the other, after the other. There's too much information for you to stop and read them all and to think critically about what is actually happening. So your brain automatically relies on that snap judgment thinking. That's bad enough to begin with, because that means you're not actually reading the stories and going in depth and getting the context that would provide you with the information you need to make a real judgment as opposed to a snap judgment. But what happens secondarily when you're making those snap judgments is that you're relying on your confirmation biases. So whatever you want to believe is true is the first thing that you're going to think it is. And so tens, hundreds, dozens, whatever number, depending on who you are being constantly hit with these one after the other speed scrolling, trying to ascertain what's happening. And at the end of the day, you just say, you know what, I can't really tell from all this, so I'm going to decide what it is that I wanted to decide before I even saw this information. So the irony is, and this is how I like to frame it, is our media ecosystem, the information superhighway, if you remember when we used to call it that in the 90s or 2000s, it's not an information highway, it's a validation highway. And we are using social media, which is completely tied to traditional media, obviously, not to inform us, but to validate what we already believe. And that's because of the reason that I just said, that we don't have the time to think critically about the flood of information that we're getting. Instead, we rely on these snap judgments and just end up believing largely what we wanted to believe anyway. To cut through that, you are literally talking about trying to cut through millions of years of human evolution, for starters. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. So you have to cut through that, and then you have to find a way to break through it with your content, which is almost impossible because you are fighting against the confirmation bias that may have been developing for 50 years or 14 years or however old the person is. But those are two of your primary competitors as a brand when you are trying to persuade or inform or entertain even a consumer or a customer. You are working against some really challenging neurological and sociological behavior by an animal known as the human being, right? And we like to think of ourselves as this highly intelligent creature, but which is true, but at the same time, we are also guided by these older elements of just simply being an animal that up until 100 years ago had an entirely different schema for how to survive in the wild. And those rules that we learned over those millennia don't apply, as you can imagine, to things like Twitter and so forth.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? It's almost like you said, that we've almost gone back to our kind of primal gut instinct for what we're looking at and consuming. How do we, and this question for both of you, maybe Jess, you'd like to start with this one. How do we kind of move back towards critical thinking? Because that, for me, is the greatest way, particularly when I talk to my kids who are both teenagers in schools, and we're not being taught how to think critically anymore. There's almost not time to think critically. How do we kind of get past that? And how do you guide clients through all of the anxiety around what they're seeing?
Sure, right. It's a complex stew right now, and I've heard so many people say, "How do I explain this to my kids?" Whether they're 6 or 16 or 26, quite frankly. I think it's really critical to continue to guide our clients to make ethical decisions. At the end of the day, we are strategic counselors, and I believe that we have an ethical obligation to provide sound and ethical advice. And I think if we deconstruct, the role of public relations over the years, we can see where we've been complicit in driving untruths. And I think that should, be a wake-up call to all of us to make sure that we don't perpetuate that. So how do we do it? I think, we're in an environment where certainly in the US, we have a government that's setting the agenda. It's setting the agenda for media, setting the agenda for conversations. But there are other forces, right? There are consumer demand signals. We've got, board votes. We've got boycotts. We've got all kinds of things that are other forces that that influence the market. So again, back to being a social scientist, I believe in the theory of change, right? And the theory of change is thinking about where you want to be in the future and how do you work backwards from that. So for our clients, I think, one of our recommendations is really use that theory of change model and apply a risk management lens to where we are. So that's better analysis and, scenario planning. It's better forensics and modeling. It's active crisis management. And at the same time, what is that sort of ethical leadership space that companies or sovereigns or organizations want to be in? And maybe they can't be there right now, but if they think about where do I want to be 1 year, 2 years, 3 years from now, and then work backwards from there, what's that roadmap? So it's a complicated kind of risk modeling approach that's very different than sort of the transactional, proactive, here's what we're going to do for the next year approach that we used to have. It's much more strategic.
Yeah, absolutely. David, did you want to add anything to that?
I will just say that I agree 100% on the long-term goal setting, as Jess says, is a or the solution. Where it becomes complicated sometimes, of course, is that it runs headlong into the challenge of, we'll say, a publicly traded company that has more immediate demands on financial results. And so if you think about, should we take this action that we believe is true to our mission and is ethical and is who we believe that we are, and certainly who we want to believe in 3 years, but we are going to see a dip in productivity for the next 3 to 6 months, that's a challenge for some elements of the organization, right? And I think getting everyone on the same page to acknowledge, again, like I said before, we're not where we were. So the drive to kind of, lead this constant refrain of more productivity, driving sales, driving growth quarter by quarter is fine and fundamental to business today, but it is not consistent with what Jess just said, even though Jess is right. So how do we, as organizations, as companies, brands, and so forth, how do we wrestle with that dichotomy to try to figure out how to make both of those things work in concert together? Because on the surface, they don't work well together. But it's very true that because of the ambiguity and where we are today, that no one can predict. If I see a 5-year plan, I would like to read it carefully to see in 5 years how close it came, because we don't know where we are. That's fundamentally my position, is we don't know where we are. So let's batten down the hatches, so to speak, and protect ourselves so that we can ride this out, as opposed to acting like, well, that might happen, but let's just pretend everything is normal and do business as we've always been doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, given that there is no, I never thought we'd come to this point in my lifetime. There is now no common set of facts agreed in society, almost anywhere in the world, and particularly that it seems in the West. And it's that's a really difficult one to get your head around, isn't it? And as communicators, particularly where earned media and communications is nuanced by the nature of it, isn't it? We're often communicating very complex issues, particularly in areas like healthcare. We look at climate change. How do you kind of balance trying to cut through with truthful, complex messages, given that audiences are making quick decisions, they're doom scrolling, they're misinformation and disinformation even are kind of a regular part of our information diet now that we're having to filter. How do brands and as their advisors, how do we kind of navigate that when we do have a set of facts to communicate?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's something that was identified. I think the Speaker of the House, actually, John Boehner, many years ago, identified that as a problem in our political system, that we no longer were reading the city newspaper, and we no longer were operating from that common set of facts. And we're also seeing a place where the non-negotiables have become negotiable. There are things that we could take a consumer poll, and 87% of people would say that they want less plastic pollution in the world, or they want less mercury in the air. But those things are distorted in the media. So I think that public relations has always been a Rosetta Stone for complex issues, to demystify things. Years ago, when the Obamacare was being debated, it was such a complex bill, so many different pieces. But the two key messages were improved outcomes and decreased costs. And that's something that everybody could agree on. And we're looking at market realities, like no one wants more expensive whiskey or more expensive eggs or more expensive cars. These are things that we would think are universal. So, really making sure that we're communicating in a very simple way that people can understand without all the complexity. Most people don't understand, really how tariffs work, or, and why should they, or really how government agencies function. But they can understand, concepts like, what does this mean to me? And so I think making it relatable and translating complex ideas for our audiences is as important as it ever has been.
Yeah, it's I love that idea as kind of comms as the Rosetta Stone. David, do you have any other thoughts on that area?
Yeah, I would just add to that it's important to have a really clear understanding of those people who are going to innately resonate to what you're saying, your position. So essentially your allies or your advocates, that kind of thing. And throughout however long marketing and advertising has been around, we've always understood that to get a person who that you want to inform, if they are already allied in general with your thinking, which is what Jess is talking about, everybody or nobody wants to pay more for eggs. Starting from that position to be able to articulate that message is quite simple when the person wants to believe what you're saying or trusts you. The new reality that we're talking about today, to some degree, to me, is the other side, the dissonance side. Understanding when you come out with whatever simple message you are coming out with, who are the people that are going to be offended or take issue with what you said, and understanding how they typically respond to negative comments or negative news that they don't believe in or don't feel aligned to. In some cases, you can trip yourself up and ignite a firestorm online because you upset an apple cart so much that you have a mobilized attack against your brand. That's one extreme. The other extreme is nothing happens. You might have irritated a few people and 400 social media posts in 3 weeks were generated in a negative way, and that's completely irrelevant. Not to the people that were complaining, of course, but to the brand. And so going in a more informed way when you are coming out with that simplified message is really key to make sure that you're down to the words that you're using. Think about how that message comes across to people that innately just they don't like your brand, they don't like your reputation, whatever the case is, they don't like your category that you're in, whatever the case may be. I don't think that until the last few years or so, we communicators and marketers gave a whole lot of thought to, like, there's a common refrain in our industry, right? Like, move the movable and essentially ignore the people that you can't change. Even that has changed in our ecosystem now, because while it's true you're not going to change their mind because of social media, because of the ecosystem that we're talking about, because of AI and the tools that they can use, now that immovable third, or whatever that number is, can really harm you. Before, it was don't spend ad dollars or marketing or communications dollars against them because you're never going to convince them. just ignore them and put all your energy and money toward the movable.
Mm.
Now that immovable is also part of the equation, and you have to tailor your conversations and your content to at least acknowledge, to not strike a match in the wrong, camp, so to speak, to cause you even more problems.
Mm. Jessica, just following on from that, I'm just thinking as David's talking, it feels like the old certainties about how even fairly non-confrontational messages in the before times, as you said, how a message will actually land. That feels like it's more unpredictable now in the current evolving political landscape. It feels a little bit to me, listening to David and you, that risk and crisis preparedness, which were the exception, where if you knew that you were going to have a particularly difficult message to communicate, it feels like risk and crisis preparedness in comms, this might be the rule now, not the exception, given that you just are not quite sure how anything is going to land, and the combative nature of social discourse now.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I've always worn two hats at the agency. One is public affairs and the other is issues and crisis management, because they have kind of been married to one another now more so than ever. And I think I see the industry and our colleagues across the agency moving to this risk management model, which is built more strategically, with more care, built on more research and modeling, and is much more iterative. So it is about issues management planning. I guess my mantra would be workshop the present and blue sky the future. As David said, you can't, do sort of this ivory tower theory of change and work backwards if you're not, paying attention to where you are in the present. So I think, the outcomes are a tale of two worlds, right? So if we can be guides for, our clients to help to kind of create the kind of world that we feel that we'd want to live in, then that's really a great sort of ethical compass. And I do urge people to not just think about the moment. How do I get through this particular moment and communicate about something that's controversial? But at any time that you're thinking about the moment, also think about where you want to be future cast, right? Think about where you want to be a year from now or 3 years from now. That's really critical. And I think that's so often what's missing. When you work with nonprofit organizations, they always have a flat 5-year plan, right? They think through, how are we going to build our community? How are we going to build our audiences? Who are our contributors, our stakeholders? And those organizations really think on a longer timeline, which I think is really powerful. And then we work with a lot of sovereign governments, and we work with a lot of companies who are really just, focused on either today's press conference or tomorrow's shareholder meeting. So I think that longer term strategic lens is absolutely table stakes.
And if we just kind of look at the current political climate, including what I'd see as a worrying push for eliminating DE&I, which is, again, and we've been talking about DE&I and values and being good corporate citizens for so long now, and to have that kind of overturning or splintering and dissolving before our eyes, I find terrifying personally. And the changing language we're using around things which were all about being for good as a business, that's all now influencing consumer behavior. So how can brands kind of stay true to their values, respond to government signals so they don't get into too much trouble without alienating an audience which is kind of changing its own thinking and behavior? How do you manage all of that, David?
Boy, you gave me a real hard one there. First of all, I would say that it's not wholly manageable. It's about deciding within the organization, which points are you going to stand behind no matter what, if that makes any sense. And there are so many reasons to think about it that way, not just because of, is it in your financial best interest to stand true to who you've been saying that you are for a decade or longer, you also have to remember what that says to your employees and your customers and your stakeholders, that you are standing firm and true to those messages. But I don't want to imply in any way that that doesn't come with a huge cost. My point is that there are huge costs either way, and thinking about both of those outcomes before you have an action, or before you take an action, excuse me, is the prudent thing to do, because there's no way that you are going to, in this day and age, talk about something as incendiary as DE&I, for example, or any of the other larger cultural narratives that are happening. And so one of the areas that I try to counsel our clients on frequently is that typically in the past, again, for however many decades, when you are advocating for your products or services or promoting or giving you the messages that you want out there, you are really focusing or hoping that it is going to have some sort of seismic shift and all as well. But now you might move 3 steps forward with your messages, but there's going to be 1 step backward. The raining on your parade metaphor. It is raining. It's going to rain. So you need to make an informed decision about what you are coming out with and saying, by being wholly aware that it is going to cause disruption, and being aware of who is going to be disrupted and what tools and practices and techniques they use to disrupt you. You need to know that before you come out with your messages. So I talk significantly about campaign readiness as much as I talk about crisis and issues mitigation. And by campaign readiness, I mean, it's essentially, to your point, Maja, that you made a moment ago, about we're all kind of in a state of crisis and issues response. You know that when you come out with a significant message, there's going to be an element of at least an issue that is going to come into play. And so acknowledging that that is happening, doing your due diligence of research and gathering of data and information about the parties and the factions and the groups of people that you may be offending, and then making it a determination as to whether or not that is worth the effort to promote the messages that you were talking about. So I talk a lot about just simply being more informed, because you have to make a decision about, we're coming out with message A. We know that it is going to rattle the cage of audiences, L, M, and O, and P, and we're okay with L, M, and N, but P is one we really want to avoid. So let's recraft our messaging to make sure that we don't unnecessarily ignite something that causes us further trouble.
Jessica, what advice are you giving to clients about when to speak up and when not to say stuff at the moment? I mean, what brands feel is the thing they're going to stick with, as David said, no matter what? Is that changing? How are you actually counseling your clients at the moment around all of this stuff?
Sure. And that is the $36 million question. I think that we would be ill-advised to tell our clients to sort of ignore the realpolitik of everything that's going on. And, it's very, very important to be aware and be sensitive to what the ecosystem is. So one of the things, we just did an interesting webinar the other day with some experts, from both sides of the aisle, and both of them agreed that right now is a moment for, do not freeze. David was talking about evolutionary programming, right? Do not freeze and do not go into fight or flight, but just be quiet strategies, be thoughtful, build those strategies with more minds. None of us is as smart as all of us. And David talked about the need for bringing, different expertise to the table. So, there is no one size fits all. There is no easy answer on complex questions, whether they're around DE&I or other issues. But I think that, quiet and informed strategies are the best way to proceed right now. And, clients who are going to ground and not doing anything and they're freezing, that's not a strategy. And hope isn't a strategy. and getting shot at isn't a strategy, right? So I think, again, this sort of very nuanced, very careful kind of quiet contemplation that's built on better information, better analytics, more research, more minds is the way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I've just had the words from that hymn, the still small voice of calm. It's almost like, as well as being trusted advisors, we need to be that thoughtful voice of calm in this absolute noisy chaos, rain everywhere landscape, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, a calm in the storm. Yeah, it's that's really critical to making good decisions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Again, therapeutic lens. You never want to make a decision in your life based on fear. You wouldn't want to make a decision in your business based on fear.
No, it's hard not to, though, isn't it? I could talk about this with you guys forever. This is just absolutely fascinating stuff. It's like you said, David. I can't wait to see how we write about this, how we unravel what's happening.
Yeah, my daughter's a journalist, and she's young, and she's been writing about things that most journalists will never get to write about, that significant of moments in history, right?
Yeah.
She's living it, and I'm constantly telling her, like, you are writing history right now that is so significant. But it's hard to remember that because, we're tired and we're in it. So.
We're really tired, aren't we? I think we should probably think about wrapping up, but I always like to go out on a kind of positive, constructive note, because obviously we are all tired of this stuff. David, for you, what are the 5 key things that brands and your clients should be doing to prepare for the yet more uncertainty ahead this year and beyond? What's your advice for action steps businesses can take to continue to navigate this landscape?
I would say first and foremost, we as PR people, especially media relations people, we all appreciate the importance of news judgment, knowing what a news outlet is going to respond to in a pitch, or how to speak with a reporter to get them engaged or interested in a particular story. We're all very, and rightly so, proud of our well-honed news judgment. We know how traditional media works. We don't talk enough about social media judgment and how it actually works, and it's a significantly more complicated environment than news media because of news media's historical standing. But just trying to not have there be a divide within your company or your brand between, quote unquote, the social media team or the digital media team and the communications team. Like, bridging that gap will bring you value that you would not have anticipated, because both sides of the equation play a key role. Both sides have a ton to offer, but for some reason, there's often a disconnect within organizations where those two, of course, while they're, in the same playground, they're not playing the same games of kickball, and they just aren't working well together. The second one would be, I've said many times, you got to concede that it's raining. Don't look for solutions that are going to holistically solve the problem. There is no perfect message. There is no perfect fact sheet that is going to solve the problem. Whatever you do say is going to be met with a challenge. That challenge could be small, but it could also surprise you, and you may be selling, soup, and suddenly you find yourself in an argument about DEI on the internet, or people are arguing about your brand in relation to DEI, even though you're selling soup. Just conceding that it's raining, and it's more than just about your product and service. It's about how your company is living in today's society amongst everything that we are experiencing. A brand is interpreted just as much like a human being as a human being is, and just acknowledge that fact. I mentioned thinking about dissonance is important. I really believe that it is so easy for us to fall back on what has worked, as I said, for decades, which is, how do I appeal to the movable middle? Think about that immovable third at this point, and stop thinking like you don't have to address them or consider their impact, because they have a very real impact. Improving generally, what I've noticed for social listening, improving your social listening to go above and beyond what is kind of largely done today, which is using a powerful but limited social media listening platform. What is not usually understood is most of that data is coming from one platform. So if you are divining your strategic communication strategy based upon your social listening platform of one, you are defining your strategic comm strategy with a very limited sliver of what people are saying on one particular platform. By and large, the numbers are, right around 90%. And I don't think that's very well understood. And then lastly, trying to just have what I call a forensics approach to understanding the holistic environment. So consider what it means when we say this is a political conversation, it's an anthropological conversation, it's a social science conversation, it's a psychology conversation, it's an evolutionary conversation. It is so much more than this frantic drive to what can I just put on the website or in that TikTok post that is going to really resonate with the audience. It's not that simple anymore, because all of us are suffering from the ability to discern truth, to sift through all the information, and to be able to take the time to think critically. Therefore, you can't rely on that is going to happen. You have to understand the doom scrolling bit that we were talking about earlier. You have to understand that that's what's happening in the human's brain when they are scrolling through. You're part of that information stream, or as I called it, the validation superhighway. It's much, much, much more than just messages and intensely awesome creative. It is understanding all of the factors that are disrupting humans' ability to ascertain truth. And we are all, as stewards of brands and communicators, we are all caught up in that, and it's just not as simple. And more than anything, just doing more spending more effort in trying to understand the complexity, so that you can architect better strategies against that problem.
Fantastic. 5 really good tips there. Jessica, what are the 5 key things you think brands should be doing?
Sure. I'm going to give you the 5 A's. A number 1 is alone. Don't go it alone. Please don't go it alone. Involve more minds, more disciplines. Make sure that you're getting support and help to navigate the environment. Number 2 is assessment. Be clear-eyed about both challenges and opportunities. That means, as David was saying, better data, deeper insights. A number 3 is adaptation. Adaptation is the key to a changing ecosystem. 4 is agility. So be ready to act quickly. And this means, scenario planning, being ready to act in the moment, but also be thinking about the future. And the 5th A is admirable. I think that don't lose sight of your ethics, your community. I think that it's really critical for organizations to continue to want to lead, maybe quietly, but not performatively. So continue to be admirable. And I think that those things, those 5 A's are maybe a little bit of a roadmap.
I love that. I'm going to close by adding a 6th A, which I think sums everything up that we've just said, and that's acceptance. We are where we are, and the path forward isn't that clear, but there's definitely things we can do, and we're all having to evolve fast as communicators and brands in this landscape and evolve our thinking. But absolutely fascinating discussion, guys. Thank you so much for your thoughts and expertise and bringing in so many areas to talk about. Loads of food for thought. So thank you very much, David, and thank you very much, Jessica.
Thank you, man.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. It was our pleasure.
You've been listening to the PRovoke podcast, brought to you by PRovoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.